Hi, my name is Luke Schramm. I'm the committee chair of the Special Committee on the Drugs and Law of the New York City Bar Association. I want to welcome everybody tonight, and thank you all for coming. New York State has come a long way with marijuana from 1977's decriminalization to the NYPD arrest campaign in the 90s and early aughts to legalize medical marijuana. Now we are preparing for legalized recreational marijuana, and we have a great panel tonight to speak about some of the issues that New York City will deal with in going forward. I want to introduce our panelists tonight. We have Axel Bernabe, who is the Special Assistant Counsel to the Governor on Health. We have Joseph Levy, the partner of Helbraun and Levy, council member Donovan Richards, as well as Stephen Epstein, founding partner of Barket, Epstein, and Kearon, and Jerome Levy, who's a partner at Duane Morris. Moderating tonight will be Kristen Jordan, who runs the cannabis practice at Newman and Ferrara. So if everyone wants to give a round of applause for our panelists, I will get everything started. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you to the New York City Bar Association for hosting this panel discussion this evening. Thank you also to Luke Schramm for producing this event, and to the Drugs and the Law Committee, the Hospitality Law Committee, and the New York City Affairs Committee for sponsoring tonight's program. I believe that discussions such as this are important as they serve as a portal to set the tone for fair business practices, provide support and legitimacy to diversity and gender equality, and provide a general roadmap for the emerging industry. I'm honored to share the stage with some of the city and state's leading authorities in their respective fields, and like you, am eager to hear their thoughts on what legal and policy changes are necessary to transition the unregulated cannabis market to a viable, inclusive, regulated commercial industry with attainable access points. Since we have limited time this evening, our discussion will focus on cannabis business licensing, land use and zoning as it pertains to retail operations, and tax revenue implications for the city. Finally, we'll hear how the governor's office is preparing for legalization. The current pending bill, introduced by Senator Kruger and Assemblypersons Crystal Peoples-Stokes, known as the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, or MRTA, legalizes the production, distribution, and consumption of marijuana. Further, the bill removes marijuana and marijuana products from New York's Controlled Substances Act and allows for regulation under the New York State Liquor Authority. Joseph, given your vast experience with the SLA and alcohol licensing, how do you set the stage for the challenges cannabis poses that are distinct from the licensing of alcohol?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, we don't have all of the information yet, so I can't tell you exactly how this is going to work. But certainly from an infrastructure perspective and from a general licensing perspective, it's probably going to be pretty close to the way the state of Illinois works with new applications to sell liquor in a number of ways, in that there will be different tiers, different types of licensing. So in alcohol, you have your wholesale licensing and you have your retail licensing, and they're kept very separate. And a lot of what we're seeing throughout the country with the way that the cannabis licenses are being issued and applied for, also very separate. You have your manufacturing license, you have transportation licenses, you have retail licenses, and they're all very Sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So it'll be similar in that there'll be the different licenses separated into different tiers like that, and it'll be similar in terms of requirements for the licenses with the actual company itself, the individuals involved, vetting process for the location. There will have to be a way that it fits in the specific town, the specific municipality. There'll be involvement at a few different levels. Better than the way that alcohol beverage licensing works right now, because that code was written a long time ago. This one's going to be drafted pretty close to now. So it's going to be interesting, it's going to be enlightening, and hopefully it'll be a modern version of what a lot of people consider to be archaic with a lot of the way the liquor laws are written. So I think there'll be some similarities. Whether, when all is said and done, the State Liquor Authority is going to be the agency that actually does govern this, I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think that the way that Massachusetts has gone with this, with their own separate Cannabis Control Commission, is going to be something that New York may have to look at. Just from a sheer bandwidth perspective, I know the State Liquor Authority is pretty well backed up now with their regular alcohol licenses. So I know that when this comes, there's going to be a lot of action, and there'll be a lot of applications, and there'll be a lot of interest. So in order to keep up with that, I think the idea, the prospect of a new agency makes a lot of sense. The question is whether they can throw together the infrastructure and the agency in a timely enough manner for it to make sense.
If the licensing process stays within the liquor authority's purview, can you give us an insight into how the community boards would react to the application?
Sure, so it's an interesting question, and for anyone who's done alcoholic beverage licensing in New York City, the community boards do really play a big role in it. Before you can even file your application to the state agency that issues the liquor license, you have to notify the local municipality. You have to give them 30 days to respond to you before you file with the state. So in that 30 days, they can either decide they're not interested in hearing from you, or they can call you into a meeting. If they call you into a meeting, there's a whole presentation to prepare, there's a questionnaire to prepare. You have to do a certain amount of community outreach and really vet the space and make sure that what you want to do will work in the space, will work for the people who live next door, right across the street above it, things like that. It's a pretty big process, and a lot of the people in the neighborhood are extremely vocal. So to the extent that there would be a similar process for the cannabis licensing, I imagine there'll be something like it. I mean, we've seen in Massachusetts, they have a similar structure in that you do need to get, some sort of negotiated agreement with the neighborhood that they're in before you can move forward towards a certain point. You do have to do a certain amount of outreach. So there could be a similar process like that for community boards in New York City. Now, will it be as involved as the liquor one? Will it be the same people? Will it be a different subcommittee? Obviously we don't know yet.
So with respect to Massachusetts, we're seeing some issues with those community host agreements and the Cannabis Commission not overseeing those and reviewing those agreements. Do you think that the Liquor Authority would be the agency to review those agreements, or would they stay with the community boards? Or
so it's interesting. I think at the very least the Liquor Authority will give some guidance, because that's the process right now. With liquor licenses, when you seek a new liquor license, you go to these community boards, you work out your agreement. The community board then takes the resolution and sends it to the state. So the state's familiar with the process, how they're reviewed, what stipulations you can really hold people to and not. So at the very least, there'll be some guidance on how to deal with that stuff.
Do you have any advice for potential cannabis operators in advance of legalization to prepare their communities or engage for local support?
Pay lots of attention. Pay lots of attention to what people are doing. This is all like uncharted territory here. And I think to the same extent that a lot of us are paying attention to what's happening in other places, I think, other people up in Albany are doing the same thing. I don't think anyone knows what the right thing to do is here. You can't know. So seeing what works and what doesn't, and I would say just pay attention and look at the models that are having success and look at similarly situated places in other states and pay attention to what they did.
So I'm interested in your insight. This is the first time I'm hearing that potentially there could be a new agency. What insight can you give us as to what movement there is for that, and how the Liquor Authority stands on that issue?
It's my feeling. It's my feeling that it's going to be a different agency, and like I said, the only reason I feel that way is because of how much alcoholic beverage licensing I do, and how much work I do with the State Liquor Authority. Just my opinion is that to add this big thing onto their plate doesn't seem like it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And all the different working groups that are talking about this right now, there's no representation from the New York State Liquor Authority in any of them. So to me, that's sort of an indication that it may not go there, because you think they want their inside right.
So securing real estate is another hurdle that operators in regulated markets face. Jerry, I was hoping that you might be able to give us some insight into some of the key challenges that retailers will face when looking at zoning.
Well, when looking at zoning, the zoning resolution obviously has divided the city into different areas for different uses. And the appropriate use for a cannabis retailer is going to be a commercial use. There probably will be no serious movement towards trying to cite these places in residential areas. Now, with the medical marijuana program, originally most of the individuals who were granted licenses were living in what you might regard as a doctor's office model. And it was going to be a very sterile medical environment. With the changes and the allowing of related goods to be sold, it's much more now a drugstore kind of thing. It looks more like Walgreens than it does like your internist's office. So what you have is a commercial establishment in a commercial area. And it seems to me the biggest problem that people are going to have is the not in my backyard syndrome. That what will happen is that there are a lot of people who think, oh, isn't it wonderful to have adult use marijuana available, but they're going to worry that if it's on their commercial street around the corner from where they live, that there will be lines of hopheads waiting around to try to catch a little bit of grass from some of the people coming out who maybe bought more than they needed. And they will worry about things like long lines of people waiting for the store to open in the morning, or crowds on the streets of the kind of people that they fear. And it seems to me that this is going to be an issue that has to be done.
Are there areas of the current zoning and land use regulations that would need to be revised in order to accommodate the industry?
Well, it's an interesting question. The way we see the zoning resolutions now and the administrative code, you could accommodate them in most commercial zones. But it may very well be that either the city council or the city planning commission may decide they want to get a greater handle on it. Right now, it would appear, I mean, if this is a drugstore-like environment, there wouldn't be a need for a special use permit. But if the city council or the planning commission were to decide they want to make this particular use the subject of a special use permit, then you would have a entire different administrative process put in. Any of us who have done the wonderfully named ULURP process in the city of New York know how exhaustive this can be. And if you have a special, if you make a requirement for a special use permit, the would-be marijuana retailer would have to sell, or would then have to go through the ULURP process, which is time-consuming and difficult. And you never can tell what's going to happen. But there's there, like with the State Liquor Authority, the involvement of the community boards becomes a key factor.
So, Jerry, can you help me anticipate what this would mean for communities of color specifically and low-income communities?
Well, I haven't seen much that would be different. I think that you will have objections from all strata. That there certainly has been a perception in certain areas that communities of color have had certain undesirable things dumped on them. And where you have that perception, you might say, well, then, they don't want it on Fifth Avenue, but you can, have marijuana on 135th Street. And that could be a problem. Although, my feeling is that there will be a universal issue because there are pockets of people who will object to this or who will fear it all over the city.
We actually do have one of the medical providers on Fifth Avenue at this point.
That is very true.
Yeah.
But medical, again, there are certain differences from adult use.
Public safety and vehicular security are two of the major issues facing urban communities like New York City when addressing legalization. as New York City will likely set the tone for other densely populated cities. Councilman Richards, could you share with us some of the conversations you and your colleagues are having in City Council?
Well, I'll start with the first conversation, and I think the council sort of drummed this up a few months ago, and I have the honor and distinct honor of chairing the Public Safety Committee, which gives me jurisdiction in the council over the New York City Police Department. And much earlier this year, as I assumed this position, we started to look at the disproportionate numbers around arrests and summonses given to people of color. And largely what stoked my interest was that the 105th precinct, which I represent, which is comprised of Laurelton, Roseville, and Springfield Gardens, which is remotely representative of the black middle class in New York City, we led the city for nearly a decade in arrests and summonses in marijuana. And when we looked at the numbers, we were just astounded. So we held a public hearing on the issue, and the NYPD eventually did provide the data, and the data clearly showed that there was no correlation between what they said led to enforcement, 911 and 311 calls around this issue. And when we looked at the data, we largely saw that there were other communities that were not of color who also were calling about the same issue, but largely 86% of all arrests and summonses were happening in black and brown communities. So the council pushed very hard on this, and we did not let this go away, and that's what led to the NYPD's shift in policy. And not to say that we are totally out of the woods, because the strategy has changed now to criminal summonses, which can still lead you into the system if you don't answer a warrant, a summons. So largely that has been the first amount of work that has happened. And now we know that the state is certainly looking at this specific issue. And, I think we, over the course of the next few months, and I've had the honor of going to some of the hearings already, the state held a hearing in Queens governor's office just a few weeks ago. Largely we're thinking of all the things that were mentioned up here. We're thinking of zoning, citing. But the other area we're very interested in talking about is justice for communities that were largely disproportionately impacted with these arrests and summonses. And what does that look like for us as we legalize? There should be conversation around expungement of people's records tied to legalization. We cannot legalize marijuana, and we should not legalize marijuana in New York State without first addressing the underlying issues that happen. So there's also an interest around ensuring that Main Street, and when I say Main Street, that the communities of color who were largely disproportionately impacted by enforcement also get a piece of the pie. And that means ensuring that if we're going to cite these facilities, that we not just be consumers, but that there's a process where if we don't have access to capital, that there's a process from the state to lend us access to capital. Incubator space, we should be able to own as well and not just be consumers. So that's largely been a big conversation that's come up in the council as well. And then we are working, my committee right now, my committee in conjunction with the General Welfare Committee, we just introduced the bill around reporting through ACS. There are a lot of mothers, believe it or not, young African American and Latino mothers who've had their children taken away over marijuana. And we need to ensure that ACS is more transparent in what that looks like, and ensure that mothers aren't losing their children because someone smelled marijuana coming from an apartment that may not have even been the mother smoking it. So those are largely some areas of interest for myself, and the council will be looking at more comprehensive things, such as a resolution also in support of legalizing marijuana over the course of the next few months.
With respect to the CPS issues that specifically mothers are having, I'm hearing a lot about that as well. Is that something that can be addressed by the city in advance of legalization, or
Yeah, well, my bill in particular requires ACS to start to report report on the opening of cases for investigation of child abuse or neglect that largely are centered around marijuana. So for example, a parent or a caretaker's marijuana usage, inadequate food and clothing, shelter, or other specified allegations put against mothers. So we absolutely, as a city, have an obligation to also clean up our house as well, even as the state looks towards legalization. But I think this is an unjust thing, and we had a press conference on the steps of City Hall where a mother came and her child was taken away from her newborn because the boyfriend had actually been smoking. She hadn't been smoking. But the allegations were put out there, and ACS had to acted on those allegations. So no, it's a real issue, and that's why we're looking at the passage of legislation around this area.
Are there any protections for parents who are medical patients?
Parents who are medical, I mean, that's, once again, a conversation around we're going to have with ACS as we move forward. But if you are smoking legally, or you're using it for a medical reason, I would also argue, let me just back up for a second. When you talk of access and who's getting access to medical marijuana, a lot of times it's not individuals in our community, right? So I think that's a conversation that has to continue. I don't want to misspeak and say yay or nay, but I would say a lot of individuals who are having more access to the medical marijuana are not the individuals on 125th Street or in South Jamaica, Queens. And there needs to be, obviously more resources put in that area to make sure we have access to that, especially when you talk of access to health things. A lot of individuals in our communities don't have access to that.
Well, what are you hearing specifically from the constituents?
Hell, it's a mixed bag. So we held a town hall earlier this year after we started the conversation with the police commissioner. And largely what we found at the town halls at first, before people were educated on what exactly was happening in our local communities and what that disproportionate arrest and summons impact looked like. A lot of individuals were concerned about people driving while intoxicated. People were concerned about walking to their park or their grandchildren having to endure smoke as they walk to the park or played in the playground. But I think once we started to educate individuals on, listen, your grandchildren are being put through the criminal justice system. And once you're put through the system, that is a life sentence for many young black men and women in this city. Locked out of housing opportunities, locked out of student grants, right? Locked out of the job market. So I think people have had an aha moment. I would say a lot of our seniors, because they're the ones who come out to a lot of the meetings and who will have complaints about it. But the other thing we've seen the community turn towards, and I'm noticing, sometimes it's generational.
Sure.
A lot of young people now are coming up and they want to know how can they be a part of the enterprise coming. How could they ensure that Wall Street is not the only one benefiting off of legalization, and how could they get a piece of the pie? And I'm telling them they need to keep a close eye on this. We should look to places like Oakland, who've done some creative things, and I don't want to vouch for Oakland and say they got it 100% right, but there were some things that they did that I thought were creative. So we're largely hearing young people who want to be engaged and want to benefit, and economic development and economic justice should also be a theme as we talk legalization for communities of color.
So I was fortunate enough to be in LA last week with some of the drafters of the social equity program there, as well as some folks who are involved with the Oakland programs, and there are problems.
Yep.
And I'm curious, is there any talk among cities, and city council specifically, about implementing social equity programs on the city level as opposed to the state level?
Yeah, well, we have to wait for them to legalize it, but I think once again, there's going to be a lot more conversation around this. I think we're going to have a package of bills and resolutions that we certainly are looking at as we move forward. But absolutely, there should be, as Oakland did have a social justice application or something, I forgot exactly what the terminology was, that they used. But looking at the particular zip codes, who should be prioritized through this process? When permits go out, permits should be prioritized for the communities were most impacted. And then also when you look at the effects of gentrification, and I think one thing Oakland did to safeguard that, and I'm not here to vouch and say they got it 100% right, but they looked at, perhaps prioritizing those who may have lived in a neighborhood going back over a decade or so. They looked at those who had a record, who had been summons, and in the areas that were under siege over low-level marijuana offenses, and they prioritized those areas. So that is something that the council and my committee and others will certainly be interested in. And just from another standpoint on reporting, and I just want to turn back to that for a second, we passed legislation through my committee which required the NYPD also to now report on race, breakdown by race of who's being arrested, where they're being arrested, so that we can also make sure there's some transparency there. But those numbers, data is so important in this conversation because data should help us to drive policy that will ensure that economic justice for a lot of the communities we're speaking about receive a piece of the pie as well. I also just want to point out that the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hasty, has also spoken about expungement through this process as well. And I think that that is a critical part of this conversation.
Well, one of the challenges that was expressed in LA when I was there with their social equity program was, that it's set up and designed to give access to people of color, to people who've been affected by the war on drugs, and so the intents purposes are there. However, the capital and the access to funding sources is not there because we don't have traditional methods either. So what they're facing is a lot of predatory behavior, and with Wall Street downtown, wondering if there's thought around what we can do to essentially protect folks and make folks aware of different opportunities and what that looks like.
Well, I think during the passage of this, these conversations should certainly be attached in negotiations. And I know I'm a city council member, but I know at the state level, the conversation certainly around access to capital has to be a part of any package of legalization. I think the state is going to raise an incredible amount of money off of this. Perhaps there can be funding set aside for startups. There can be, I know another challenge has always been space. Where would you grow? So I think incubator space being a part of the conversation is certainly something important. I think they did that in Oakland as well. So I would say we're raising a certain amount of money a year. The state should certainly be thinking about MBEs and thinking about a way to fully engage all communities through this process.
With respect to transportation and public roadways, Stephen, what changes are necessary to ensure personal and patient rights are honored while ensuring public safety?
I first just want to comment on an issue that the councilman just raised that's important, I think, and it crosses over to probationers or people on parole. The legalization of marijuana doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the criminal justice system, or you were talking about the ACS, should be using it, right? So just it's the analogy to alcohol. We're going to see a significant analogy from marijuana to what has happened with alcohol. So if an individual comes into the criminal justice system, for example, is on probation or parole, can they consume alcohol? Well, it's dependent upon the offense that brought them there, and is there abuse of it? Is there a need for treatment? With marijuana, it'll be the same thing. So I think the consideration is not just whether or not it's legal. So should it be an issue involving ACS? It's a question of whether it's abused, whether there's a problem with it, and whether there's something that we need to do from a rehabilitation standpoint. Now, your question on the traffic safety, I think, is an important one. It's probably what the councilman says most people are concerned with. A lot of people don't know the research, don't know the background and the history, but first of all, marijuana is prevalent in an unregulated and uncontrolled market right now. Every study and the NHTSA, National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration's roadside study in 2013 showed a 48% increase in marijuana use from 2007. And the other thing to consider when looking at this is most peer-reviewed research suggests that there's a significant doubt about a correlation between the use of marijuana and impaired driving. And that's an important thing for the public to keep an eye on. However, that being said, there significantly, obviously, delta-tetranon hydrocannabinol is a psychotropic drug. It affects our mental functions to some extent. The question of whether or not it substantially impairs our ability to drive is a different issue, right? And the Department of Health report that suggests the legalization of recreational marijuana, Dr. Zucker's report, and I think the quote was that the positives outweigh the negatives, right? So the question is, may the legalization of recreational marijuana lead to more drivers on the road who have consumed marijuana, right? That's going to be the question. And while the answer may be yes, in the totality of the circumstances, the positives of the legalization, I think, are going to make it safer on the roadways. I think they're going to make it safer for the community, and here's how. First of all, the major change is going to be there's going to be a much more significant awareness by law enforcement officers on what to look for when detecting a driver whose ability to operate a motor vehicle is impaired by marijuana. You know, prior to the last 5 or 10 years, it was basically the Cheech and Chong exception of the car doors opening and a great big billow of smoke coming out. Or, right, or, you know, my clients who are smart enough to admit to just smoking a joint or keeping it in the ashtray. Meaning that law enforcement didn't really have the ability to detect. There was this myth of the green tongue, which we all know is just, I mean, it's really true. This is what law enforcement used to think, that if you smoke marijuana, you'd have a green tongue. So the legalization of marijuana is going to bring income stream of somewhere in the area to 400 million, 600 million. I mean, we don't know what the numbers are going to be. And I think obviously there's going to be a targeting of use of those funds for educating our law enforcement officers, training them on A-RIDE, which is alcohol recognition that also involves drugs and impairment, as well as DRE certifications, which are drug recognition examiners. But just even without those officers who are trained through the public counsel sessions, through the legalization, through the discussion of it, they're more aware of the issue. I think you're going to have a movement towards validated, standardized field-side sobriety testing, which we've had a problem doing because the government didn't feel comfortable dosing people with marijuana and then testing their ability to drive. We've had no problem doing it with alcohol because since 1933 and the passage of the 21st Amendment, it was okay to drink. But once we have recreational marijuana lawful, we can conduct dosing experiments. We can put people in simulators. We can test their ability to drive. And we could also create standardized, validated field-side sobriety tests, which will enable law enforcement officers. There's another thing that we could do. We could spend more money and we could train officers to use field screening devices, such as the saliva test. So, you know, there's a test right now that's put out by Draeger called the Drug Test 5000. So a law enforcement officer can take a swab of saliva from a motorist's mouth, which is non-invasive, and gives you a quick positive, negative that could then later be sent for, for confirmatory testing. So those kind of things, I think in the end, are going to make our roads safer because those drivers are out there now, right? They're not driving because marijuana hasn't legalized. That's crazy. That's like to think in the 1920s there was nothing called a speakeasy and nobody was consuming alcohol. So I think that's going to be big. But here's the other thing. When we talk about the roadways and the health, there's a greater issue, right, of the health concerns that aren't limited to the roadways. All studies show from all of the states that have legalized recreational marijuana that there's a significant reduction in opioid use. There's a significant reduction in synthetic marijuana. Synthetic marijuana is scary. Synthetic marijuana can lead to death. People are creating synthetic marijuana to avoid detection in drug testing, which is no longer going to be necessary if you have legalized recreational marijuana. And the people that it's preying on the most is our youth. So the legalization of marijuana, and here's the biggest thing. The biggest thing is the packages will be marked, the public will be educated, the consumer will know what the dosage is, and it'll be safer for them to use, which also makes safer drivers, right? Because the same people who are the consumers are going to be the drivers. So I think the pros outweigh the cons, and in the end, our roadways, I truly believe, will be safer.
So you talk a little bit about, we were talking earlier before the panel discussion about consumption versus impairment.
Right.
And how that comes into play with like a roadside sobriety test.
So, alcohol is an example to look at. Our statute says there's two different ways of prosecuting driving while intoxicated by alcohol. We have common law DWI, which is basically you operate a motor vehicle while your ability to operate the motor vehicle is substantially impaired by alcohol. And it's called common law because it predated the use of breath testing devices, which interestingly enough, date back to 1938, just 5 years after the passage of the 21st Amendment. So if you really want to pay attention, and people are saying pay attention to what's going on, pay attention to history, right? Look back at what happened after the passage of the 21st Amendment, and what evolved from that was breath testing devices, things like that, right? The problem with marijuana and marijuana detection is it's short-lived in the system. When somebody consumes marijuana, the psychotropic ingredient is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which most people refer to as THC. But it residualizes in the fat cells, and it stays for 30 days in a form called carboxy. I mean, technically it's delta-tetra-9 carboxy 11 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is people refer to as carboxy, THC. There's no psychotropic effect of carboxy, it's just a derivative. So law enforcement testing needs to test quickly, right? They need to get in there and test quickly for levels. The problem is, and here's the issue, right? Most of the studies show that there's no correlation like the way there is with alcohol. We know that at certain blood alcohol concentrations, there's a certain impact on drivers. It's not the same for marijuana. There is no correlation. Right now, the studies don't show. Now, there may, once we have recreational marijuana, we have more dosing experiments, and the government can spend more time in research, maybe the studies will validate it, but right now it doesn't. So how do you prosecute people for this? Do you create a per se level, even though you know there's no correlation between a per se level and the ability to drive? Well, you do if your job is to make the prosecution easier, right? So I think one of the things the government has to look at is a three-tiered system. It's the European equivalent. There should be an analysis of certain cutoff levels that are just traffic infractions. And this is important because it's going to give the government the ability to get rid of the cases out of the criminal justice system. We have a big issue in New York right now, which is that driving while mobility impaired by alcohol at its lowest level of just impairment is simply a traffic infraction, and it gives prosecutors the ability to get the cases out of the criminal justice system where they don't want people to get criminal convictions. Most of my clients, 95 out of 100, are first arrest DWIs. They don't have a history of criminal convictions, and they're going to wind up with a criminal conviction. Right now, if we go forward with the law as we're all talking about it, driving while mobility impaired by marijuana to any extent will be a misdemeanor. To any extent by alcohol is a traffic infraction. So we need to look at a way that we can funnel these cases out of the system where prosecutors make a decision to use their discretion so that people don't wind up with criminal convictions. And the question becomes, what is the goal, right? So you asked, how can we detect whether somebody's ability to drive is impaired? You know, the clear answer to that is, what was the driving, right? And it connects to the driving. And the best way to prosecute somebody for impaired by any drug is proof that there was actual operational impairment. But there's a significant number of cases that come through the criminal justice system where there's none. We have sobriety checkpoints throughout the city of New York. Motorists drive up to a sobriety checkpoint, they're doing nothing wrong. The only reason they're stopped is because there's a checkpoint. So how do you prosecute that person, right, for impaired driving when they did nothing wrong? And it's going to simply come down to a policy decision about what we want. You know.
I'm also thinking about these field sobriety tests. So, you know, as the industry matures and ingestion methods and you know, types of products become more varied and different, topicals, such, they do contain THC. Will they show up positive, even though they are not intended to appear here?
Yeah. Oh, well, it depends. So it depends upon the dosage and how it's going to take about an hour to 2 hours, and your screening test won't detect the quantification level. So for example, right now, alcohol, you can take a breath test, right? So you can blow into a breath test, and because alcohol, you're trying to get a blood alcohol concentration level, there's a correlation between the amount of alcohol in your blood and the amount of alcohol to your breath. Generically, it's not a fixed ratio, right? The same types of tests are right now available through using saliva tests. There's actually what they're calling a breath testing device for marijuana, but it actually is not a breath testing device. It's a breath testing device that deposits saliva into a box, and the saliva is stored. So under New York's existing statute now, anybody in this room that drives a motor vehicle has implicitly given your consent to a test of breath, blood, urine, or saliva. Those are the 4 things that could be collected. So it's already in the statute. So long as the officer has probable cause to believe that you're operating a motor vehicle while impaired by alcohol or drugs, they can then ask you to take a saliva test. So your client who's taking a low dosage of delta tetra, I mean, if they're taking THC, so they're not taking CBD, right? They're taking, and here's the other problem, is some tests are only for cannabinoids. So that test is going to come positive for anything, right? Even for your CBD, it's going to come positive for that. So the question is, what are you looking for? And the problem is you have to accomplish two goals. Law enforcement has to have an ability to make a decision in the field quickly and secure the evidence. That's why the saliva test is probably the best way to go. It uses immunoassay testing, which is decent for screening. It's like your home pregnancy test. Strip changes colors because there are antibodies on the strip that get attracted to whatever they're looking for. The problem is there's lots of false positives. We all know that. You have to go for a blood test, right, to confirm that you're pregnant, right? Same thing with the saliva testing for THC. Officers can take a swab, they store it, they keep it. You get a positive screening test, they can make an arrest. They now then send that kit to the lab. Now the lab has to do gas chromatography to confirm that it's delta tetranine hydrocannabinol, and they can then do a quantification analysis at that point. Does that answer your question?
I'm curious what lessons we can learn from what's happening out west.
I think great lessons, but I think the biggest lesson is probably in the taxation, right? One of the biggest benefits that we have of recreational marijuana is we eliminate the uncontrolled market, right? The unregulated market. And we don't want to pass legalized recreational marijuana and then have drug dealers selling uncontrolled, unregulated marijuana, which is dangerous, like synthetic drugs. And what happened in Washington is a great example. They set their tax rate so high that it became so expensive to buy it in the regulated market that the unregulated market continued, right? So we have to tax it at a rate that will succeed in doing that. That's a big thing. And I would look beyond the states. I would look to the European models too, to take a look at how we can set up our statutes to ensure that we make the roadways as safe as we can. But I think the biggest thing is the tax issue.
But in terms of the VTL, the vehicle and traffic law, what types of lessons can we learn from, for instance, Colorado, who a little bit further along there?
You know, I think we're further along than most states. And I'm part of an organization called the National College of DUI Defense, where I lecture, right? So I go to a lot of other states, and I speak to a lot of other attorneys that do the work that I do. And in New York, we have a mechanism, we have a statute, the driving while ability impaired by alcohol statute, that allows people to, as like an escape valve, you know. So the comparison is when people get arrested for a non-DWI offense, and it's their first arrest, they're a non-violent offender, and the prosecutors don't want this individual to have a criminal record. They can reduce it to something called disorderly conduct, which is a violation, not a crime. The person doesn't have a criminal record. It doesn't impact their life tremendously. In New York State, we have a similar statute, VTL 1192-1, which is driving while ability impaired by alcohol. Now, it's a non-sealable offense, so it's a little different. It does have an impact on your life, but it doesn't give you a criminal conviction. I think in terms of looking at our regulations, we need to make sure that when we legalize, because we're going to, right? When we legalize marijuana, we need to make sure that we have the same provisions in place for driving while ability impaired by marijuana. Because if the law, if it gets regulated now, if it gets legalized, and this person over here gets arrested for driving while ability impaired by alcohol, and this person over here gets arrested for driving while ability impaired by marijuana, just slightly impaired, that's a traffic infraction, that's a misdemeanor. And that makes no sense, because all the studies demonstrate that this is a safer driver. Right? So at a minimum, it needs to be on equal terms. And the other problem is going to be our criminal justice system will be overwhelmed with cases that can't be resolved, that are going to have to go to trial. You know?
What impact do you see, or if any, on public transportation? Legalization?
You know, whether or not less people are going to drive because they can recreationally consume marijuana. I think the biggest impact on it has been Uber. Right? We see more people taking public transportation because it's easier. With the studies and what we now know about the number of people that still currently consume marijuana in an unregulated market, I can't imagine it would be that significant in a regulated market. But you know, as Joe said before, we don't know, right? This is somebody had that quote, right? We know what we know what we don't know, and we don't know what we know about what we don't know, right? I forgot who it was that said that. There you go, there you go. So whether or not, I certainly would expect that certain people knowing, and you know what's going to come down to? Once they get arrested for driving while ability impaired by marijuana, and they realize that they have to spend $15,000 to defend the case, because it's still going to be a crime. You know, making marijuana recreational legal does not mean you can drive while your ability to operate a motor vehicle is impaired by marijuana. And I think what will happen is because there'll definitely be a rise in arrests for driving while ability impaired by marijuana, no doubt about it. So those people, it's specific deterrence. Those people that get arrested for it, they're using Uber. So I guess the answer to your question is probably yes, but not as significant as most people would think.
How specific is the field sobriety test? Will we be able to tell when the consumption occurred?
Well, that's an interesting question because the offense is operating a motor vehicle while your ability to do so is impaired by alcohol or drugs, so it relates to the operation. But the testing is usually at some point subsequent to that, and which is why the saliva test is such a good device, because it allows the law enforcement officer to test it on the scene within 5, 10, 15 minutes after a roadside stop. So it's not going to show you. Well, okay, so I think the answer to your question is it could. And the way it could is, right now in New York State, the way we administer our law for alcohol is we, by practice, not by statute, we're a single test state, which means that we take one test of a person's blood alcohol concentration. It's a single test. However, if you want to know, and you want to be able to extrapolate back, is what you're saying, we want to know what was the time of consumption, what were they at an earlier point in time, then you need to take 2 samples. And if you take 2 samples, say 15 minutes apart from one another, then you could establish whether the person is absorbing or eliminating, and you could establish rates of elimination or absorption, and then you could extrapolate back. You need more data than that, but otherwise it's just going to give you an answer as to whether or not it's in their system.
And is that information specific to the person, or is it universal?
Elimination rates are pretty universal, and absorption rates depend upon metabolism, body weight, and there's a host of other factors.
And I'm curious about how law enforcement behavior will be impacted. Are we going to see more stops? Are we going to see more activity?
Yeah, we're already seeing it. You know, I said before, there's a thing called DRE, which is Drug Recognition Evaluator. They like to say Drug Recognition Expert, but I guess it's all about choice of words, right? The Drug Recognition Evaluator, so there's a 12-step test. And if we would have had this conversation 3 years ago, there's a website you can go onto for the Department of Transportation website that'll tell you what officers are DRE trained in every county of the state. And if you would have gone on there 3 years ago, you wouldn't find one who was DRE certified in New York City, you wouldn't find one. Now you'll see several. And here's why, because the federal government has seen this coming years ago, you know. And there's been a lot of money that's been spent on research and grants and studies, and there's been more money to train officers on DRE. So there'll be more officers trained to detect the use of marijuana, because marijuana will be recreationally legal. So, and that's the key, right? That's the reason why the streets should be safer, because police officers will be able to detect marijuana impaired drivers.
So in May of this year, Deputy Controller Lou Black, your office released a report entitled Estimated Tax Revenues from Marijuana Legalization in New York, wherein it was estimated that a legal adult use marijuana market at some $3.1 billion per year in New York State, about $1.1 billion of that in New York City. In turn, the Controller's Office estimates that this market could conservatively yield annual tax revenues of as much as $1.3 billion total at the state and city levels. That assumes a combination of state and local sales and excise taxes in line with what other jurisdictions have passed that could yield up to $436 million in revenues for the state, $336 million for the city, and some $570 million for localities outside of the city. That's a direct quote from the report. Can you talk to us a little bit about how your office determined these calculations and how other industries such as hospitality and tourism have factored in?
Sure, thank you. So this estimate is what in technical forecasting terminology is called a WAG, or a wild ass guess. But the Controller's Office Controller Stringer's predecessor did an estimate in 2013, I think. And subsequently now, as this conversation came up again and the bill was passed as part of the budget this spring, we thought it was time to update it. And in particular because we have a lot more information now from real life experience in other states, particularly Washington and Colorado. So we decided it was time to update our estimate. So these numbers sound very specific, $336 million, who knows? But, and we picked one tax scheme that seemed like a prevalent one or a common one, which was essentially a retail excise tax, plus sales tax. So there are any number of tax schemes, and we don't know what will come up, what the state will come up with. One thing to bear in mind is that the state, ultimately, the city can't impose taxes without the state's authorization. So the state will have to act first and decide what it's going to set its tax rate at, and then what it will allow local governments to set their tax rates at. And I'm sure it will give us some leeway, and then it will be sort of up to X percent or whatever the type of tax is. So in our estimate, we with reference to Washington and Colorado, kind of updated sort of usage, looked at the national survey, drug survey, household drug survey to estimate consumption, and used all of that to come up with an estimate of the market, which was, as you said, about $3 billion statewide and about $1 billion in the city. There's a lot of uncertainty around that estimate. And I think the experience in Washington, Colorado has demonstrated that the market is tremendously affected by the tax rate. As your other panelists just pointed out, you can get too greedy. So we assumed 10% excise tax rate at the state level, primarily because Massachusetts has a 10.75% tax rate. So we said, well, let's set it in a way that's competitive and assume that Connecticut and New Jersey and maybe Pennsylvania are going to get there eventually also. And then we assumed that the city would set their local rate at 25%, again, not knowing what the state will authorize. That's a high rate. There's some pieces that we left out. What will commuters do? Commuters and tourists may well, become purchasers in New York City if, especially for commuters, it's not available in their state. So if New Jersey doesn't legalize, and then it seems like that's coming also, but if New Jersey or Connecticut were not to legalize, there would be probably some commuter sales. There's 800,000 commuters who come into the city every day. I don't know how many of them smoke, but all of them.
At least 52.
I've thought about getting on the subway every morning, sure. And you have 60 million tourists, so 63, excuse me. I was rounding. So some of those are not captured in our estimate. The most interesting piece of this is really sort of how does we've heard about all the other decisions that have to be made around how you're going to go from a market that exists but is unregulated and untaxed to one that is regulated and taxed. Every decision you make has some impact on the speed with which that market gets from illicit to legal and how much of it. California is having the experience right now of a black market that continues to operate in parallel with the legal market. Washington State had the same problem, dramatically revised their tax rate down, still the highest rate, but they really realized that they were going to have to adjust their rates, or they were never going to see the market really become fully regulated. And that's a real issue, and I think that's one that it's hard to know going in exactly where the sweet spot is that maximizes your revenues while at the same time, because both because you've set the rate right to bring enough of the market into, into the legal market, that you actually capture all the tax revenue that you can. There are a couple of other considerations that we didn't go into. So there's one of them is the sort of speed with which markets become legal, and I think there's been evidence that it takes a little while. It takes a few years. So, the estimate that we came up with was essentially assuming full legalization, right? That the whole market had become legal, and that was subject to taxation. It's not going to happen right away.
Are there thoughts about year one revenue?
No, I don't know. When you look at Colorado and Washington, it's striking how steadily the market has increased over a period of several years. So you're seeing that it's taking a while. So there'll be substantially less. Well, the other thing we didn't look at, because this is beyond a wag at this point, is you have a bunch of businesses essentially and workers who are off the books right now. All those people, when they become into a legal market, their personal income, their business income is also all subject to taxation. I don't think that's a huge number. $1 billion, sounds like a big number, but in the context of the city's, almost $900 billion gross city product, it's really not. So it's not going to be a huge amount. As a budget guy, I welcome all revenue, but there are all of those sort of other effects as well that we just didn't feel like we could estimate, but which people are now really starting to think about. And a couple of states have sort of tried to back into the number, and are having it's hard to know exactly what. There's so many other fluctuations that go on with your revenues that are hard to account for sometimes.
And as legalization approaches, what impact can we see on adjacent industries like tourism and hospitality, entertainment? Are we giving thought to that sort of tax revenue dollar as well?
I have no idea how to measure what the impact might be of legalizing in New York City and not legalizing in neighboring jurisdictions. I don't really know how to estimate what. Again, it's entirely possible that you get some business initially from people who live outside of the city, and then especially if they're commuters, as the adjoining states legalize, that business will go away again. I don't think that's a big number probably, but it's hard to say. Right now there's clearly a thriving black market out there, and it is sort of well connected to sort of the entertainment industry, not the entertainment industry, and sort of people don't go to Broadway and smoke joints, but there's plenty of bars, right? Plenty of bars and nightclubs and where people are obviously smoking and presumably will continue to do so when it's legal. So.
I guess I'm also curious about, we saw in Colorado specifically, there became a cannabis tourism industry, and I would expect that would evolve here in New York as well.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. There are lots of reasons to go to Colorado, and there are lots of reasons to go to New York, and I'm slightly skeptical about honestly, about the cannabis tourism in Colorado, but to the extent that it's real, but to the extent that it's there, it's a little bit of a novelty item. My feeling is that it's a little bit of a novelty item, and especially as the rest of the country starts to sort of move in the direction of legalization, then I think it's going to taper off. And I don't, again, I don't know how to estimate it. I don't quite know how to wrap my head around it or think about it. We looked at this a little bit in the context of Colorado, and I think we were just a little bit skeptical about the numbers and weren't comfortable trying to estimate based on that, at least yet.
So what are some of the critical issues you see once we ultimately decide on the tax rate? What are some factors that may weigh in on the decision?
On setting the tax rate?
Right.
Yeah, well, again, I think there are a couple of considerations. One is, so one thing I'll say is there's a lot of To the extent that tax rates differ, you're going to see border arbitrage issues, right? So you have, cigarette taxes are extremely high in New York City compared to neighboring jurisdictions. There are estimates that at least half the cigarette sales in New York City are smuggled. So we're, losing revenue because of setting the rates perhaps too high. They've had the public health effect that Mayor Bloomberg sought when he initiated it, but at the same time, we've lost some revenue probably from the smuggling. So I guess it depends on what you think is most important. I of course always think revenue is important, but it's possible to set it too low as well. You have a 7% medical marijuana rate right now, and you don't want to undercut that rate. Otherwise, you just move business from one place to another. So, and you want to take into account what you think the rates are going to be or are in neighboring jurisdictions. I think also I don't quite know how to do this. This is a little bit uncharted territory, but in a perfect world, if I could sort of design the tax system, I would phase in rates that would get higher over time to help induce the market to legalize. Because if you set rates too high, as the experience of Washington and California shows, initially, people are not incentivized to come out of the shadows and become legal. And the black market is well established. It works very well. And it will continue to work if that's more profitable for the people who are in it.
Thank you. You're all moving. As assistant counsel to Governor Cuomo, Axel, can you please provide an overview of the legalization efforts to prepare for legalization?
Sure. Happy to do that. First, though, I do want to thank you guys for setting this up, and you yourself, Luke, and Noah. I think the key to this whole process is having as much public discussion as possible. That's been a bit of a linchpin of what we've been trying to do. There are a lot of competing priorities and trade-offs that are going to need to be made. Some of them were identified here tonight. So not everybody has the same position on them, and the more you talk about them, the more you educate, I think the better the chances are that this gets done. But so from the administration's position, the interest in seriously looking at the legalization of cannabis started in January when the governor requested that the Department of Health shepherd a report, which was a multi-state report that was going to report back on the likely impact, the health impact, economic impact, and social justice impact of legalization. That report was rendered to the governor in July. It's a report that we've been mentioning, and in the weighing overall, and that there were a lot of competing values in there, but overall found that legalization was in fact a better outcome. And so we examined that report and endorsed it in August, and at that point, the governor impaneled a work group, which the members of which are public and predominantly public health focused. So there is a concern that when we do this, we do it with a public health focus. So in terms of the competing, I might disagree a little bit on tax rates to the extent that it would drive serious problems in consumption, such as $3 a gram rates in Oregon or Washington. We'd have to decide, is that something that we're comfortable doing? What does that mean for access and for potential use or cannabis use disorder or other substance use disorder? So these are the issues that our work group is examining. At the same time as we paneled the work group, we started a process of 17 listening sessions across the state. That just recently finished, and we're working on trying to provide a bit of a summary that we're hoping to make public next week. And then simultaneously, we've been just in full stakeholder engagement. We've met, I think, as many jurisdictions as possible, as many interests as possible, from the medical society to the addiction professionals to the state police to the local police chiefs and sheriffs. And we're still working on that, and we have a legislative outreach strategy where we talk to all the members that are currently involved in promoting some form of cannabis legislation. So we've been doing that. We've been talking to other state regulators. We've been very, very busy. Yeah.
So I'm curious, so you mentioned the working group, and as Joseph said, there was no one from the State Liquor Authority appointed to that group. Also absent were members of the industry, the current cannabis industry. So I'm curious as to how that group was formed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. There are no members of the industry, just as there are no other interest groups. Really, the group was fairly big already. There are a lot of state agencies that are represented there. SLA actually is at the meetings, it just wasn't the formal attendance. Really, the focus again was public health. We wanted to keep it, most of the folks that are on the work group are PhDs. It's really about establishing, a lot of the priorities are about establishing baselines. A lot of the, several people made the comment about having data drive our outcomes. So before you have good, in order to have good data, you need a baseline. So prior to legalization, so you want to make sure that you're measuring, it could be in driving, be it rates of incarceration, be it the informal market and what that is. And so you can measure your progress. Are we getting people from the informal market into the legal market? Are we arresting in a less disproportionate manner? Are we stopping people that are, intoxicated? So I wouldn't read too much into the work group, but certainly one of the questions that has to be asked and that we are soliciting input on is, where does this program belong? I think there's a general consensus that the program should have the medical program, the adult use program, and probably hemp CBD, which is another topic that's ripe for discussion. But all of them really are derivatives of the cannabis plant, and they all have a similar physiological effect. They all sort of belong together. They should be manufactured in the same way. They should be distributed in similar or related ways. So it doesn't make sense to have them fragmented. And in speaking with regulators across the country, they've suggested that should be housed in one entity. Now, whether that entity should be in the Department of Health, Department of Taxation, like in Nevada, in the State Liquor Authority, that's an open question. I think each agency has its own culture, and this is a bit unique. So so we are considering all options, including a new office of some sort that could house all three. But we really ask people to weigh in on their thoughts on that. I think the culture is going to drive a lot of how we view this. If it's in tax, it's going to be much more of a revenue priority. If it's in health, then you get into the issues of, should we allow flower to be consumed, and it tends to weigh down the industry. If you want a social justice goal, which is a big consideration for us with priority licensing and disproportionately affected communities getting some of the revenue, and investing in growth, then you have a different economic sort of development bend, and all these things have to
I'm glad you mentioned hemp. I'm originally from Syracuse, and I was recently up in Binghamton, and the conversation around the farming community there is access to capital, the same as it is with cannabis THC. And so I'm curious as to the governor's position on assistance with banking.
So on banking, a couple of months ago now, the superintendent for the Department of Financial Services that regulates our banking and insurance industry issued a memorandum encouraging banks, especially state chartered and local banks, to bank the cannabis sector, in particular the industrial hemp and the medical. That's all we have. And so what we essentially did, we were the first state after the repeal of the Cole memorandum, which is what most states relied on in issuing combined bank guidance. We were the first one to come out and say, despite the repeal, we are actively, we are going to support the old memorandum and use that as, know your customer rules, and if you do your due diligence, we will encourage you and attempt to sort of protect you to the best of our abilities if you're banking marijuana-related businesses. So we've done that, but banking, I mean, every one of these topics deserves its own panel, but certain, access to capital is a big issue on social equity licensing. Banking's an interesting one. You get a lot of folks that are proposing sort of closed-loop systems or kind of blockchain-based systems, payment cards. So there are a lot of ideas floating around. I don't know how feasible those are in terms of regulatory alternatives, but I think if you build a robust program, what the banks have told us is that the more robust your program is, the better the compliance is, the better the track and trace is of the plants, the more comfortable the banks are in knowing the full, there's no diversion, there's no suspect customers, and the more comfortable they are to bank the industry. So I think, I think you need to have a robust program. That's the number one, solution to make.
So can you do me a favor and set the record straight on CBD?
Sure, CBD, that's an easy one. No, I can't. That was ironic
The
enough.
CBD derived from industrial hemp.
Well, no, look, CBD is interesting because the way we see it, so we've been canvassing a lot of states and speaking to regulators to see how everybody else has done it in various states. And for the most part, people are going in a similar direction, and there are some synergies that are lining up. On CBD, there are two solitudes, right? There are a number of states like Michigan and California, Ohio, that have effectively said that CBD that's produced and sold outside of their adult use dispensaries or medical marijuana dispensaries is illegal and is subject to the FDA's rules on food additives or dietary supplements, which the FDA said CBD is not. And other states like Colorado, Washington, and Oregon have nurtured the industrial hemp and CBD industry, but to an extent where they have no regulation. So nobody has any good manufacturing practices, nobody is enforcing or licensing, except in a very cursory way through their agricultural department, CBD. So you have very different approaches. And so we have to figure out a way to navigate that. We haven't found a solution, but I would say that a smart way to think about CBD is that it should be treated at least like a dietary supplement. So you should have good manufacturing practices. You should have labeling that's actually disclosing the per milligram dose. Ideally, you would have testing that probably should be close to what we do for medical marijuana. So you want to have contaminants, you want to have heavy metals, you want to have all the different sort of molds. And then you want to know where it's being sold, but that's the current thinking. But we're canvassing farmers and CBD growers right now. We have an industrial hemp program. That's where we are. I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go off the script a little bit, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about testing. Right now, we have the Department of Health as our official laboratory testing. Once we have legalization, what do you anticipate? Do we foresee private testing labs coming into the space as well?
Yeah, so testing is another interesting issue. It turns out, a lot of people characterize our program as being one of the most restrictive in the nation, our medical marijuana program. It was probably 2 years ago when it was enacted. We've liberalized it significantly. And some of the things we did restrictively turned out to be really, really positive. Anyways, and labs one of them. So Wadsworth, which is our reference lab in New York State, happens to be one of the country's best labs. The FDA uses us for its own testing on certain things, and I think we could safely say we have one of the best labs in the country. They do all the testing for medical marijuana products, and they have their own methodology. And what's happened in a lot of other states is people do what's called lab arbitrage. So you shop around in this competition, and the labs want to give you the results you're looking for. So everybody will give you a higher THC content, and will give you a pass on some of the contaminants potentially. And they'll use different methodologies. So if you test it at 2 different labs, you almost inevitably get different results. So that's a problem. That being said, there is a lot of demand for lab testing services, and we're starting to hit capacity. So we are interested in getting other labs to enter the market, even for the medical marijuana. We're working with labs. There are DEA requirements, which make it difficult sometimes for them to participate. But we'd like to have labs that are what's called E-Lab certified, which is a pretty high designation, and have them use a methodology that's consistent and have Wadsworth supervise them. So I would say the short answer is yes, we expect that they're going to be labs, but I wouldn't consider them to be mom and pop labs. They'd probably be well-established labs that can perform pretty rigorous testing.
And I understand that Wadsworth testing is free right now for the medical program.
That's correct.
How are private labs coming into this on the legalization impact?
I'm not sure. I doubt they'll be free. And I don't know if we're going to get into the business of regulating prices. I think you'd have to ask the industry how they feel about it. Most of the manufacturers that we speak to wouldn't mind paying a little bit to have quicker turnarounds, maybe. Although I have to say, Wadsworth has been truly amazing in their work. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. They'll probably be charged.
And with respect to the listening tours, so I think there were 15?
17.
17?
Yes, ma'am.
Two additional at the end of the system?
Correct.
I'm curious to know what the reception was in those communities, specifically upstate.
It was really interesting. Culturally, it was really different in every jurisdiction. I attended maybe a handful, maybe a bit more, and everybody had a different view. Long Island. I don't know. I don't know how to characterize all of them, but there was always a presence. There is a serious concern from the substance use disorder community, like the addiction folks. They're really concerned about an increase in cannabis use disorder. And we have seen an uptick in cannabis use disorder. We shouldn't kid ourselves, right? People are consuming more cannabis and are having a hard time. It's interfering with their life. So we have to be mindful that a subset of the population is always going to be prone to addiction. And that's actually one of our big concerns, because we don't want to criminalize that conduct, but we have to treat it somehow. So we want to, but specifically on the listening tours, I think they were extremely well received. The media was very, thought that we should do that for every initiative. It's pretty time-consuming, but it was really incredible. People came out. There were hundreds of people at every single one that signed up, and everybody, they raised a lot of issues.
Was there a recognition amongst the substance abuse industry of the corresponding reduction in opioid use from the legalization of marijuana in the states that have legalized recreational marijuana?
There are some folks in the substance use community that are a little bit more open to experimenting with cannabis as a medical assisted treatment. We recently issued regulations and passed a law that added opioid use disorder as a condition for which you can get medical marijuana. But that's, we have population-wide studies, but it's still sort of something that's being explored, right? You're talking about a community of folks that are vulnerable, that are in, that are in treatment. So you just have to be careful what drugs you start to administer.
Axel, what about raw flower? Are we ever going to see combustion?
Well, so I'd rather think of raw flower as vaping rather than combustion. I would, recommend that anybody, inhale burning matter. It's just not good for you. I think, well, and that's a tough one. That's just difficult. I mean, I have my opinions, and we're discussing it internally. We understand. I can tell you all the pros and cons, certainly, but I can't tell you what the administration's ultimately going to do just because it's still something. We're looking at so many issues right now, and I'd love. Anybody interested? I'd love to talk. I love talking about this stuff. It's been my life for a little while now, and there's so many things that you don't think of when you're balancing all these interests, and everything triggers everything else. But overall, we understand that the price will be driven down significantly, which was a concern we heard a lot. I think if you can find a way to vape flower and to encourage people to vape rather than combust, that would put aside a lot of the concerns with combustion and smoking and an uptick in that. I think in adult use, you can't really, it's difficult to limit combustion and the sale of flower because there are populations that are really, that's how they consume, and then you would be marginalizing them in a legal system, and you would risk disproportionately impacting them in enforcement if you didn't let them consume the way they're used to consume.
Vaporization requires mechanisms and certain things that are costly and cost prohibitive to certain communities. Combustion is the cheapest form of ingestion methods, as far as I understand.
My understanding is vape pens can get pretty cheap, especially if you're vaping, if you're vaping flower, you can reuse it, and I don't know if it's cost prohibitive.
I think I recently read a study that said that there actually wasn't a correlation between COPD and combusting raw flower. Curious as to...
Yeah, my little... I mean, look, it's just probably not a good idea. And thankfully, what we've seen in mature markets is a diminution. It is just a diminishing of the flower segment. It's down to 30%, I think, or something in Colorado. People are turning. What?
It's a lot of edibles in those.
A lot of edibles, a lot of vaping, a lot of oil. Oil tends to be the most popular. It's just more convenient, in stores.
We're ready for some questions.
Nice panel. Thanks, Kristen. My question is about extraction. What are we thinking of? What are you thinking of for manufacturing? Which is going to be a very significant piece of the business. And we're talking mostly about dispensaries, but that will go away.
You're talking about manufacturing and licensing?
The question is not licensing. What are we thinking about for land use, for building use, for location, for licensing?
Jerry, you feel that on land use in terms of
Sure. One of the things that I was thinking of when I was thinking of this presentation is that one of the real questions is when we talk about zoning, in the city of New York, we don't think about areas that are zoned for agricultural use. And certainly in some of the upstate communities, you see that there'll be large areas that are zoned for agriculture.
Well, manufacturing is not agriculture. And that's what I think New York State needs to focus on in a very clear way, because that's going to be the future of our industry.
Well, one comment on that is that you're growing a vegetable product probably in a very large warehouse.
But I'm not growing I buy my biomass and I make my products in legal states, and I want to do that in New York. How are you going to enable that?
Well,
And especially in New York City.
if you don't, in New York City, it may not be possible. You may not have the space.
We have kitchens. It's the same as having a kitchen.
I think that what's going to happen is that it's got to be looked at carefully.
Well, that's the point. That is my point exactly. I think you're in land use, and that's not taking over buildings or building specific facilities. But I would like to ask you, Axel, what you're thinking of.
Well, so, what am I thinking of? So we think that if you, first there's cannabis as food, and then there's cannabis as extract. So if you're talking about manufacturing and you want to sell seeds, and you want to extract seeds and put them in granola bars, then all you need is a C20 kitchen. And I think you're going to be fairly able to do that. You can do it already now if you have irradiated seeds, and they're not viable. So you could probably do the same thing if you want to take the baby leaves off the cannabis plant and put them in a salad.
What if I buy biomass and I want to make tinctures or pills or things like that?
Right, well, so currently federal law prohibits the transfer of cannabis across state lines, so you wouldn't be able to bring it in from
Well, I
Kentucky.
would buy it here.
Okay.
I didn't buy it from cultivators, they sell it.
Yep, they certainly, well, they will. And I'm assuming you're talking about THC products, not CBD?
Talking about full spectrum. I don't think that there are, as far as we know in research, there are more than 525 different genetics that are ascribed to cannabis. And we don't know very much about them in this country. Although in Israel, in the Czech Republic, in Spain, we're getting a lot of very significant data.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just say you'd probably want good manufacturing practices, you'd want GMP.
I know what I want, but what do you want? Because you're going to license me if I come to New York.
meant as a society, collectively, what we would want, what you would want, what one would want,
Yes.
is GMP, right? So, so good
The bare
manufacturing.
minimum.
Exactly. You'd want good testing, and you'd want good labels, right?
But where am I going to house my facility? Where can I buy a building and have manufactured under legalization in New York?
Well, I mean, I don't know that you have, I'll defer to Jerry on land use, but I don't know that you have that many restrictions. It depends, again, what you're looking to do. If you're extracting with CO2, you're going to need, I don't know, what do you need, 20,000 square feet? That's probably more than what you need.
Not at
And
all.
then you can,
Not at all. But I'm not saying what I want. I'm saying what the industry wants. We want to be able to manufacture here.
right.
We buy our biomass here. So what this really is, please think about this very carefully, because this is a major direction of our business. And it's going to be an extraordinary revenue generator and an extraordinary not tax, but research generator. In research, there's a dollar amount that for every dollar we spend in research, I think there's $27 that we get back in New York City and New York State. So it's a very complex and very delicious problem. Please solve it for us in a way that's wonderful.
My name is Paul Gilman, I'm with the Greens, and to piggyback on what you were, I have a lot to say, but to piggyback on what you were saying, we're wanting to see a strong homegrown provision in which we have like way more than 6 plants. 6 plants is not enough. The New York State Greens propose 99 plants or less, not for sale, not for trade. We want to undercut like the neurosis caused by the big profit industry where all kinds of corruption will have. We feel like if there's strong homegrown, there'll be less corruption. And as far as taxing goes, and in New York City, there's community gardens, there's agriculture. A lot of people, I'm from Queens, we have backyards. You can grow like 5 or 6 plants in your backyard, really nice ones. You have basements, you can do hydroponics. So we want to make sure that the only regulations we want to see there, and in the whole industry, is no GMO, no pesticides, no additives, and no THC manipulations the way the tobacco industry manipulates, whatever. So, so taxing too is like, for all products in New York State, it's more or less 4%. If you're gonna make like something out of oil, like plastics are all made out of oil, it's all 4%. Textiles are taxed at 4%. Paper is taxed at 4%. So we don't want a special marijuana hemp tax on these products. They should be taxed at the same rate or even less as a way of getting this new industry started. Okay, it's in the form of substance tax at 2 or 3% or 1%. Okay, so I'll leave it at that for now. Oh, and one last thing for Mr. Niblock, you're talking about marijuana tourism. I agree, as it becomes normal throughout the whole country, there'll be less tourism, no need to come to New York for pot. But right now, New Hampshire has extra low liquor taxes, so they have like a little mini tourist bowl. Like whenever I go to New Hampshire, I try to buy a couple bottles of tequila.
We never have extra low taxes in New York City.
Comment on the home provisions and organic pot issues? Someone?
So the MRTA does have Homegrow.
Right, but 6 plants or less is not enough.
Is there any thought by the governor as to increasing that? I know in New Jersey, there is no Homegrow option out, actually.
I mean, we're looking at Homegrow. We're definitely looking at Homegrow. We're looking at Homegrow.
There you have it.
And what about organic pot? We don't want like poison everybody. That says a lot. There's no comment on that. We regulate stuff that's supposed to be for health and safety, not for economic domination. So we're keeping an eye on that. We regulate it so that companies with lots of capital and political connections are the only ones to access to licenses, then the whole thing is a bunch of crap. That's why we want a lot of homegrown and priorities for, as Councilman Richard says, for community partners for the drug war. So the fact that none of you comment on organic pot or homegrown in any real sense, banning GMOs, that's a big deal. You're not even going to care about that. Monsanto is going to come up. And what about barring liquor companies, pharmaceutical companies, and tobacco companies and multinationals for participating in our local industries? What about that? That's a way to ensure that the locals have the dominant place in the economy. Whenever I say that at these various hearings, it's like I can hear the crickets chirping from all the politicians up there. Because Governor Cuomo got $25,000 from Purdue Pharma in the last election cycle. And Purdue Pharma creates OxyContin, and they've been funding a lot of Democratic politicians. And they don't want to see marijuana legalized because, as it was pointed out, there's a 25% reduction in opioid use.
We're going to the next question.
Draw notice.
I don't want to dovetail off what the woman in the industry said about extraction, because we can see from Colorado what their experience is. We can see what's happening even in the CBD industry in New York. You can walk into any place in New York and you can get all manner of quality of CBD with up to, whatever that minimal percentage of THC is. So we clearly have a market that's already happening. When we talk about producing extractions in New York for whatever purpose they are, we're going to have two sizes of industry, the same as we will in the marijuana industry, the cannabis industry. We're going to have homegrown, we're going to have kids from Williamsburg, kids from Long Island City going into those marvelous spaces in those group kitchens and making product. And they're going to want to get that product to market. And somebody's going to want to come in and somebody's going to want to see if that kitchen is clean. Somebody's going to want to see whether or not they're storing chemicals or storing any combustibles in the process of manufacturing any of the products they're going to be making. You guys have to have a good scheme for this. You can't fumfer around with it, right? It's trial and error can really mess this industry up. So, with all due respect to land use, you got to know what extraction is. You got to know what goes into extraction in order to legislate it, in order to regulate it. You got to know what goes into a grow house in order to regulate it. So please, make sure you're talking to real professionals about this, and you're not filling in the blanks about what this dynamic industry is doing in every segment of it. Please, be very, very conscious of that.
In regards to insurances about the industry, I sell insurance that is outside of New York now. Auto insurance, you can't cross state lines. Federal monies are not being, the banks are not funding the industry, so people are having a hard time getting insurance because you can't just walk with a suitcase of cash and pay your insurance bill. Are there going to be any regulations as far as what insurance is needed and provided? As somebody who works for an insurance agency, I'm being asked these questions all the time. I can provide those insurances, but it's kind of like the Wild West, and there doesn't seem to be any real discussion about insurances in general. For product liability, especially in New York, I mean, I do have CBD clients, but as far as the states that are legal, they, New Jersey's going to be legal, but what if that car goes over the Lincoln Tunnel? Does that make the car not, that has marijuana in it? Like, where is that going? Has anybody discussed that at all as far as insurance is concerned, and where that might be provided or needed, or what the regulations are going to be for that?
From a criminal perspective, across state lines, if you're in possession of something that's lawful in your state, but you transport it into a state where it's not lawful, you're subject to criminal prosecution. If you have a gun carry license in Colorado and you come here to New York and you have a concealed gun, regardless of whether you're licensed in Colorado, you're in a heap of trouble here in New York.
But you're certainly going to have to consider those tunnels and how we go back and forth by train and bus.
Yeah, well, no.
If it's legal in both states, I think New York and New Jersey are going to have to come to some agreement.
Yeah, no question.
It's still going to be federally legal, right? You'll be breaking federal law by transporting it over the state border.
For how long? By the time you guys get your act together, it'll be federally legal.
Well, there's a federal States' Rights Act that's currently pending, right? So, that legislation would solve the issue, although that seems to be tied up right now. But there is an act pending in Congress that's jointly sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans that will allow states that pass regulations to make it recreationally lawful in their state, that the federal government will not interfere, which will allow the banking industries to bank within that state and solve the problems. That's the real issue that needs to be addressed.
I actually have a question, I think. So I've been following this industry for 4 years now, and full-time as an investor, so that's what I do. I don't do something, I don't have a lot of practice on the side. I invest in this space. And I've been following what's going on here. And we've it's evolved, we've come from a stigma position where we were talking about medical, and then we got into recreational or adult use, and then we started thinking about the pesticides and testing, and then we started being concerned about the social impact, social justice issues. We're starting to see now on the social justice side that we can say nice things about how we're going to do this, but if there's no money available to these people who we're enabling to have licenses, they're not going to be able to perform on that. And then the latest issue to really come up is social consumption. We're starting to see this now in Colorado, California, Nevada's talking about it. That's a really thorny issue. It's going to come up. And there's no discussion here on the panel tonight. You've got limited, time and expertise and stuff here. So my question really, after all that, I promised I wasn't going to give a speech. That's my long intro here. Is about social consumption. What are we considering? What are the impacts on? What are we going to do about where people are consuming? They're consuming in the street now, right? So
It's a great question. We talked about this a little bit offline, but not during the panel. So, Councilman, perhaps you can answer this with respect to the city. And because of a thought around social consumption, and especially because of the way that we live outside of the state.
I think it's going to continue to be a thorny conversation. The way NYPD enforces, for instance, I guess I would say on this subject, marijuana is already legal in some communities to smoke. In other communities, it's illegal to smoke. And you could obviously end up in prison over it. I would say as the state regulates this, these are the conversations that we'll continue to obviously have. And the NYPD, at least under the work that we're doing, we are pushing them to ensure that communities such as my community aren't the ones who will continue to feel the biggest brunt of the impact of enforcement in cases of usage. So, I don't know if I'm answering the question the way you...
So, the only example of social use consumption I'm aware of is in Denver, where they've issued 2 social consumption licenses, the first of which is the coffee joint, I think it's called.
Okay.
And that model is that you're allowed to bring your previously purchased cannabis, which is not flower. I believe it's only edibles. I don't even think you can vape because of the Clean Air Act. And you can bring your cannabis to the coffee joint, purchase non-THC products there, and consume. Is that the sort of model where you would purchase on site? I think that Jersey, as opposed to a dispensary with an on-site consumption, which I think is what New Jersey's current bill looks like.
Too early to, I don't want to speak out of terms, too early to determine. And I think, largely as the state continues to have this conversation, I don't want to speak out of terms on it and give you an answer on where the city is at or where we are moving on this particular matter. But what I would say is that from the social justice aspect, we want to continue to ensure that our communities are treated justly.
What we can't have continue is what we now have continue. We can't have communities where are not enforcing state laws on one side of the Hudson and in another area. So if I have a client in Long Island who gets arrested by a police officer, that client is in jail on bail, and that client had that same marijuana cigarette in the city when it be prosecuted. It's a state law. Prosecutors can't enforce laws within their community differently than are being done in other communities, which is the reason why we're going to have the legislation. Now, I thought that at least one of the bills, the MRTA, proposed for public consumption to be reduced to a violation, which essentially is a non-criminal offense. And then communities locally would make decisions about whether or not they would be allowed to have what I guess we call coffee shops or locations where you can consume marijuana. And that would be dependent upon the local area, the local community, whether or not they wanted to pass zoning regulations to allow that within their community. But I think there's good reason and good measure to not have public consumption of marijuana, especially burnables. And I would say look to the alcohol regulations. There really are a lot of parallels. Just because alcohol is lawful to use if you're 21 and over, it doesn't mean that you're allowed to consume alcohol on a public street in an open container or while driving in a car, right? So just because it's being legalized or the recreational use is being legalized doesn't mean that we're allowed to consume it in any manner that we choose. It's a matter of establishing a moral compass, and that moral compass is pointing towards regulation. Now the issue is going to become the answer to all of these questions, which are social issues.
And let me just add back to that, you know, it's funny, we were at a press conference yesterday and marijuana was clear. I mean, I was with the police commissioner earlier, we certainly all would sit in there and smelled it. But you know, one of the issues we was running around, we took discuss is, what if this was in South Jamaica, right? You know, individuals would have been incarcerated over that. So I think as we have the conversation around social consumption, no one is saying that we want people just smoking everywhere. And I think part of what the state is doing by regulating, it allows the city to then come in and obviously have a conversation with local communities around what do they want to see. And I know he discussed the ULUP process, which is a very tedious, I used to chair the zoning committee for the city council. I can tell you it's not an easy process. And you can find NIMBYism sometimes in part of those conversations. So it's a very touchy situation, but I think in terms of the way, once again, enforcement is done for certain communities, certainly the impacts are different.
So I can weigh in on that. Do you want to just 2 seconds? So I think it's interesting. I think there are 2 issues, right? One is social consumption spaces where you go and consume, and that's much more difficult. I think we identified. But I wanted to just touch on what you said. So the other issue is public consumption. So we have 2 sets of rules when it comes to current substances that we regulate and we've decided where people can use them. One's tobacco and one's alcohol. You can't consume alcohol on a street, but you can smoke a cigarette when you walk down the sidewalk. So we've been talking internally a lot about this. It's a fascinating question that I think everybody should have an opinion on. So why is it that we can't have a beer open on the sidewalk? I'd say it's probably because if you consume a beer on the sidewalk, you might be unruly, right? And that public sort of consumption of alcohol leads to unruly behavior. And cigarettes, we allow because we don't think that anybody's going to get unruly with cigarettes. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, is vaping, cannabis, more akin to alcohol or more akin to cigarettes? So that's one of the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves when it comes to public consumption.
If you walk down the street, you will see 100 people in your purview vaping.
Right.
And are they unruly? No, they go about their business just like we are here.
Well, so we know we're using cannabis.
There's also a detection issue, right? So if vaping publicly is an issue, how do you know if somebody's vaping CBD or they're vaping a tobacco product or they're vaping THC? And you have Fourth Amendment issues that are going to be evident because a police officer observing somebody vaping something doesn't have reasonable suspicion to necessarily believe that that person is vaping a product that is not lawful to be consumed. So there's also the Fourth Amendment issues that look at from a standpoint. You don't want to create laws or statutes that impose obligations on police officers that they cannot enforce.
I completely agree. So it's actually not as most people react. Interestingly, the preliminary reaction is, oh yeah, of course, we're going to prohibit people smoking a joint walking down the street. But when you think about it, it's actually the framework's a little bit more complicated than that. To your point. And then the last thing I'd add is there a difference between someone vaping either nicotine or cannabis while walking down the street and someone smoking combusting a very smelly joint and walking down the street, or sitting, whatever the Clean Indoor Air Act distance is from the entrance of an office, and sitting there and smoking a very big joint that stinks up, the whole area. Is that something that's of some kind of a nuisance? For some people don't enjoy the smell of cannabis, and some people have reactions to smoke. And so is that the basis for enforcement? But we don't do that with tobacco. So how do you make those distinctions? So I think this is a really interesting conversation.
And the other piece of that that's interesting is both. If you look at the alcohol and you look at marijuana, both come from what was originally barred by statute prior to the 21st Amendment. You weren't allowed to have alcohol at all. So what you have is societal norms. You have people within society who are of the belief that the decriminalization of alcohol was not proper. Believe it or not, those people still exist, right? So you have the same thing with marijuana. You take marijuana from illegal market, you put it into a controlled market, you still have aspects of our society at our core whose social or moral compass hasn't been fully moved, and now you're putting it in front of them. It's kind of like we don't care what you do in your own kitchen, in your own living room, but don't do it in front of me and my child as we're walking down the street, because you've made it legal. Okay, it's okay for you to do it legally, just don't do it in front of my child. So I think it's also like a moral compass issue. And I think we've obviously come farther with alcohol than we're going to get with marijuana in the next 80 or 90 years. It'll take a long time to get there. But I would agree with you that the burning of a combustible, a joint, or that's emitting a significantly pungent odor, which potentially people will perceive to have consequences to people who inhale it, or secondhand smoke, depending on their education level on it, will be more offended by it.
Axel, one thing I keep forgetting to ask is, when we pass legalization and we're in the rulemaking period, which roughly is about a year or so in most states, some state models have medical operating, filling that need for adult use. Other states like Massachusetts have sort of a gifting program. What do you think New York's going to do?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. You mean, so before it's legal to...
No, after legalization,
Yeah,
pass a
before it's
bill
legal to have adult use.
before the licensing scheme and the rules and regulations come out. So there's probably a period of time in between,
Sure.
roughly a year in most states, that it's legal, but there's no licensing structure for commercialization. So in some states, medical moves over and fills that void and operates in the adult use market until the rules and regs fill that. In other states like Massachusetts, you have gifting, where there's no formal operators.
So that's an interesting question. We haven't made a decision on that. I think what you're doing there, you're going to have two different questions you have to ask yourself, right? So if you have the current medical players enter the adult use market a year to 18 or 24 months, because it takes a year to do the regs, but then you have to do the licenses, review the licenses and issue the awards. So you're looking, realistically, the MRTA says 18 to 24 months. So you're looking at a couple of years from the date of the passage of the act. That would give the current medical marijuana or cannabis producers 2 years to enter the market. So that would satisfy some demand, but I think you might have some folks in the social justice community that might ask themselves whether you're going to have small growers and whether you're going to have a socially diverse set of businesses that are going to be able to thrive if they're 2 years behind their competitors. So a very difficult question, but I can answer that.
Especially given the landscape of the current medical providers.
I'm not commenting on that. I like the current medical providers, but
I'm not suggesting that. Otherwise, I'm just saying that they don't have the social justice.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Social equity
Yeah.
component.
But one answer that, one thing we do believe would be smart is growing the medical program before adult use. So one of the things that's come out of these listening sessions and that the medical community has advocated for is, getting folks that are probably consuming a significant amount of cannabis for really an underlying medical condition, potentially. They're self-medicating. I think, there's probably a fair number of people that are doing that. And getting them into the medical program is probably a good way to also give them wraparound services like behavioral health counseling and also harm reduction strategies. You could use edibles, diminish your doses. And so I think it would make sense to find ways to grow. We're looking at options that may be available to grow the medical program in the interim. So get people in and get some of that demand met that way. I think that could be a good interim solution.
Hi. Got the mic, finally. Talking about the clean social consumption and the Clean Indoor Air Act, this has been a focus of mine for several years, and one of my concerns about the MRTA was that it made the system subject to the Clean Indoor Air Act. Now, my understanding is that because of the preemption doctrine, the Clean Indoor Air Act sets a minimum that a local government can pass regulations governing indoor smoking that can be no less restrictive than the state, which will make indoor consumption functionally impossible in New York City, probably in most municipalities. So going from there, my question is, what's necessary to maximize local autonomy under the state law? What statutory changes might be necessary to allow local governments to regulate according to their own cultural and social norms that are particular to them? Is that going to require some kind of special carve-out? Like I would suggest that the system should not be subject to the Clean Indoor Air Act, but there should be a special carve-out, or there should be a separate form of state preemption doctrine specific to cannabis consumption. But across the board, for all the questions, what's the way to maximize local autonomy, the least restrictive state control that also makes it difficult that doesn't allow the local governments to regulate the businesses out of existence? You anticipate that there must be some other change in the New York Code to maximize local autonomy.
Well, I could just speak from a New York City perspective. And I think at the state level, you have a sizable amount of state officials who represent New York City, including the Speaker of the Assembly, who represents parts of the Bronx. And I think from the state Senate's perspective as well, I think you'll have a lot of New York City voices in that conversation. I can't speak for the entire state because obviously the governor would have more of that, but we would hope that, and I believe a lot of the New York City individuals on the state Senate and both on the Assembly side would certainly be pushing for the interests of New York City and the way things are carved out. So I guess upstate is obviously much different than New York City, downstate, but I would assume that that's where a lot of these conversations would be happening.
Hi, thank you everyone. Quick question about public education initiatives. I was recently at a presentation by Manhattan DA Cy Vance. He did a phenomenal, his office is responsible for a phenomenal report, I'm sure you're all aware. He made a lot of great suggestions based on other states and their recreational experiences with legalization. And specifically, the office talked about the importance of educating the public, education before legalization. And the question I have is, it's not just about families and children, but it's about law enforcement, it's about mental health professionals, it's about educators, it's about general initiatives. And the question is, where does that come from? Where does that start? Does it start with the mayor's office? Does it start with the governor? Does it start with the folks regulating the program?
I mean, it would be my hope that I keep taking on question, but I would assume from the advocacy world there are a lot of organizations who are going to be at the table around this, and I would hope that even as legalization happens, once again, it's going to be a nice windfall. At least we perceive that comes to the state, comes to the city, and we should be figuring out creative ways to make sure some of that funding certainly goes to education, prevention towards addiction, educating our young people in schools that, okay, it is legal, but doesn't mean you don't need to be over-consuming, So I think that's at least something we would be interested in. But that has been something that has come up a lot, and from people who don't believe legalization should happen as well. I think education has been something both sides have been speaking
There are
about.
stigmas
suggesting that the education needs to happen in advance.
Okay.
And also on a greater level, rather than prevention, a discussion about the endocannabinoid system, how cannabis works in the body, how it interacts. Take the fear out of this plant. Just discuss the plant. What is it? What is the bud? What is extraction? In my experience, I work in patient relations in the medical industry today, and I have to say the greatest barrier besides price for most of our patients is fear. And I think getting rid of the fear on every level in our state is a really important, I hope it will be an important project.
Right, I fear a lot of that work is going to happen in the nonprofit sector.
Give me a call, I'll volunteer.
Can I just add something to that? I'm a psychiatrist, and I work with people who, other psychiatrists who,
Where's Mike?
I'm a psychiatrist who actually got the waiver, whatever, to prescribe medical marijuana up in Westchester, and I haven't started prescribing it yet. And part of why I haven't done it is because when I called my malpractice folks and said, what does this mean? They said, well, we'll protect you if it's an issue of malpractice, negligence, or whatever, but if the feds come after you, we're not there for you. But what I wanted to just support what this lady was saying about education, which is that I've tried to inform myself about this issue in the last few years. I've gone to Bethesda, to the big research forum they had over there a few years ago. I went to the Cuomo's forums. I went to one in Rochelle. I've spoken to people in my community, talked to people. I've worked at Rikers, so I know what it's like in terms of the young men, the young people who have suffered under this. But I have to say that for the most part, most of my colleagues who are doctors, who are physicians, are totally uninformed about this and not behind it. And I'm talking about people who may be doctors of color, and also the folks in the churches. They're not understanding this, and they're not hearing about these forums. They're not hearing about this. The education is not there. And when I diagnose somebody with cannabis abuse, when someone comes into our clinic and we're looking at this person and deciding whether we should put that on the list of diagnosis, all we need to know is that he's smoking cannabis. I mean, it's not like we're going to go through the whole list. We need to know, are you smoking cannabis? And that kind of mentality is going to have to change for doctors as well as for communities. Thank you.
Two more questions.
So to build on Martha's question about education, Councilman, you mentioned advocacy groups. I've been doing education around cannabis topics for the last 4 years. I'm proud to say I've educated thousands of New Yorkers on a variety of topics. I have some questions for the panel, one of which is, I've heard a lot about economic equity and inclusion. Number one question I get from people is, how do I transition from the underground market to the legal market? There was some talk about eliminating the underground market. The only way to do that is to include those folks and create safe pathways, and I didn't really hear much of that outside of looking at equity programs, which I think are a start but don't go far enough, so I would like to see a lot more of that. I heard some talk about child protective services and medical patients. Didn't hear anything about immigrants or visitors or anything like that and protecting them if they're medical patients. As far as consumption versus impairment when it comes to driving, I heard a lot about testing for consumption and not much about actually testing for impairment. And if you're a medical patient, again, and if you have to be consuming daily, regularly, maybe you're impaired if you're not consuming. So how do we protect those people, and how do we safeguard, people of color who are traditionally policed differently on all things cannabis from getting taken advantage of and marginalized and destroyed and, enslaved through these criminal justice injustices.
You're correct on the drug use issue and impairment, and very often we find in operating a motor vehicle while ability impaired by drug offense that very often the defense is their failure to take their medications. If they were taking it with the appropriate level of dosage after a period of time makes them a better driver. You're 100% correct about that. But how do you detect whether an individual is impaired by a drug such as marijuana will only come from validated validated studies of the impairing effects of the drugs. So, back in the 1980s, out in California was the start of validated studies for what are now called standardized field side sobriety tests, or SFSTs. And we now have 3 validated tests: the walk and turn, one leg stand, and horizontal gaze nystagmus. Why? Because the government was able to dose people with alcohol and see how they performed. The government hasn't done that in a market that's not regulated, that's illegal. So that's coming, right? However, here's the problem with that. Most of the studies that have been done so far show that it's just not true. That marijuana doesn't necessarily, based upon quantification levels, impair a person's ability to operate a motor vehicle. Certainly doesn't do it the way alcohol does it. So it's just not that simple an answer to be able to say. That's why I said before, the best way to measure whether or not somebody's ability to operate a motor vehicle is impaired is look at the driving. The individual was involved in a car accident, for example. The individual was driving too slow. It's a classic condition, right? As opposed to speeding, because speeding isn't even an indication of alcohol. It's neither. It's neither alcohol nor drugs. It has no impact. But it was those validation studies, by the way, that not only created the three-part tests, but also established a protocol for police officers to use nationally to recognize an operator who was impaired by alcohol. And for example, in phase 1, which is the operation phase, they're trained to look for 28 separate pre-stop clues to see if that person is impaired by alcohol. Why? Because we dosed people with alcohol, and then we observe them to see how it affects their ability. The government hasn't done that yet, and I agree with you. It's the same issue with the education. The better answer is educate first, right? But the reality is, because this change, this moral compass of society is changing, the reason why the doctors are reluctant is because it's illegal, right? So there's this moral compass inside of us that says it is illegal. It's only after it becomes legal that the culture of society is going to change and start to move over. And I would suggest that the education, by the way, has to come within your peer groups. Like the law enforcement, it's got to be the sheriffs, it's got to be the lieutenants, it's got to be the precinct commanders that train and get their officers certified on DREs so that they have on-call officers who could be called to the scene to do an evaluation. So where should that training come from? It doesn't come from the governor's office. It's going to come from within our professional communities, right? So, for example, I do lectures on educating attorneys on how to handle driving while ability impaired by drugs offenses and driving while ability impaired by alcohol offenses. So the teachers have to teach the teachers, the doctors have to teach the doctors, the police officers have to teach the police officers. Until we see that change in society.
Mike, I appreciate your question about vulnerable populations, like immigrants. I am myself an immigrant, and I wish I had thought to bring that up. I'm curious as to whether or not marijuana infractions are portable offenses and how we treat that in New York City.
Well, we're a sanctuary city is the answer. So the NYPD says they don't communicate with federal officials on any of these matters. But let me add to some of the things you said, and I think that there should be some entity as legalization happens that is specifically tasked with just focusing in on this issue and the issues around equity, the issues of inclusion, of making sure communities really have access to the industry. So I think that would be, to me, something that we would be interested in seeing as this grows. I mean, we just did something similar within the TLC where we created an Office of Inclusion to deal just specifically with the issue of ride hails and African Americans and communities of color not being able to get a cab. Maybe there could be some entity that's within, I guess you're not going to do state liquor authority, but part of the conversation needs to be that, and I think that should be in itself, like I said, an office that just works to make sure that these things are happening. And lastly, I'll add that, advocacy groups, if you're doing education, I think support to organizations that are doing this work on the ground already is going to be critical in its success. So I don't anticipate that there'll be, as much as I love government, I don't anticipate they'll be on Beach 56th Street in Far Rockaway. So we need to make sure that we are arming local communities and local organizations within those communities with the resources to carry out. You want to apply for a permit. How do we make sure that happens? But there has to be a local entity that really takes charge and it's for it to work for local communities. Otherwise, we'll be singing, we've been down this road before.
Unfortunately, we're past time, so we'll have to end the event now, but I'm sure you can ask questions to the panelists if they have a second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you all for participating.